I was on a quick camping vacation in the Maine forest with a childhood friend of mine, who I'll refer to as Ethan. Both of us had a good deal of experience. But this was Ethan's first visit to this location. However, I was familiar with the location because I had visited there several times. Fairly well. We set up camp in a clearing in the trees after backpacking down a track that took many hours. We got there about 6 o'clock, I believe. After preparing everything, we created a lovely campfire, prepared some food, opened a few beers, and spoke around the fire while the sun began to fall. It was a fun and relaxed evening. However, about 2 hours into the night, we both heard what we believed to be something moving just outside our campsite. That is, in the darkness beyond the light from our campfire. Nothing was visible when we looked. We didn't hear anything else for the remainder of the evening. We assumed it was simply a tiny animal running away. To be honest, I never would have remembered it or given it further thought if nothing else had happened. At the time, it seemed so unimportant. If you're not experienced with camping, it may seem unusual, but those kinds of noises occur frequently and are nearly always. There is nothing to be concerned about. After having a few beers and growing weary, we decided to call it a night, extinguished the fire, and retired to our tents to sleep. We got up early in the morning since there was a reason this location was fantastic. The reason for this is because there was a private pond that was quite private and about a half-mile away from the campsite through the forest. Since the trail didn't truly lead to it, nobody was aware of it. However, it was quite lovely, with a tiny river and waterfall flowing through it. The majority of our morning, roughly 3 or 4 hours, was spent there. After a while, we returned to prepare food and take a short break. I even napped for a little while. But once more, the sun was setting at 6 o'clock, and we still hadn't gathered any firewood for the campfire. We used up the majority of the dry sticks that were laying around the camp last night. I therefore needed to do a little more looking for the things we needed. Ethan said halfway through that he would stroll around and simply explore the other sections, picking up anything he could on the way back. Sure, I replied, and carried on picking sticks from the ground. Almost every time we went camping, Ethan would do this. I believe he simply relished spending time by himself and taking in the scenery. In any case, after gathering a sizable quantity of firewood, I returned to the camp and waited for Ethan to return so I could light the fire. As the sun continued to set, I finally became somewhat aware of it. He had been gone for an oddly long period. He wasn't usually out for this long, and he had enough experience to know that it wasn't a good idea to explore the woods so close to sundown. Our little satellite messengers were the only means of communication available to us out here without service. Along with bear spray and other such items, we always carried these in our little garbage bags. Although it is often more of an SOS gadget, it was also useful in circumstances like these. When I took mine out to message him, I discovered that he had just sent me one moments earlier. Ethan claimed that he stumbled back to the pond after getting somewhat lost. "Just stay there," I told him in a message, "and I'll be right over to guide him back. If you're lost, it's usually best to stay still rather than take the chance of being lost again." And Ethan and I were both aware of that. Knowing the region, I promptly made my way to the pond. It was essentially a race against the sun at this point. It would still be very simple to get lost at night, even with headlamps and familiarity with the area during the day. I was around 4 or 5 minutes away from the pond when I arrived. One more message. I assumed it would be him checking in or requesting an ETA, so I reached inside my bag and checked it. However, Ethan sent the message, "I see you. I see you." What did he mean? I wasn't even close to the pond yet. Confused, I paused and glanced about, but I couldn't find him. I responded I hadn't seen him and wasn't there yet. I began to move more quickly, practically racing to the pond because I was a little concerned. I arrived swiftly, sprinting up to the tree-line ahead of the water. There was no Ethan. I could see the entire tree-line surrounding the pond from where I was, but he was nowhere to be seen. I yanked the messenger back out as I felt the blood flow from my face. I hadn't opened my previous mail stating that I hadn't seen him. My voice reverberated through the trees as I yelled his name. The jungle was growing darker and quieter as the sun was almost completely gone. Perhaps he had already begun to return, as if he had somehow memorized the route. Where else would he be? I'm not sure why he would. In the daylight, I figured it would be safest for me to return and work things out from the camp since I was nearly gone. I haven't yet lit the fire. I would therefore never be able to locate the campsite in the dark if I waited too long. I started to walk, feeling apprehensive as I made my way through the trees and saw how dark the woods were growing. The menacing last message he sent was all I could think about. "You are visible to me." By the time I was about a minute away from the clearing, it was almost completely dark. Then I noticed something, though. From the location of the campsite, there was a flickering orange glow. The campfire was lighted, and I could see that someone was standing close to it as I approached. With a sense of relief that Ethan had returned safely, I began to move closer. However, as I approached, the individual abruptly changed and turned to face me before running away from the flames and out of the campground. With my heart racing, I hurried up, scared and perplexed. Ethan wasn't that person. I took out my messenger once more and began sending out spam texts. I was now rather concerned and troubled by the situation. However, only a minute or afterwards, Ethan ran into the campsite from the woods. His expression was one of relief and terror. He said we had to go right away. He said it was probably the same guy he saw approaching him by the pond when I mentioned the man I saw by the fire. He stated before he understood it was someone else, he believed it to be me. The man reportedly didn't answer when Ethan tried to ask whether he knew how to return to the trail. With a rather unnerving smirk on his face, he simply continued to advance. Additionally, Ethan claimed that there was something quite strange about him, such as an eerie quality to his face. There was just something out of the ordinary about it. In a panic, he fled in what he believed to be the direction of the campsite, getting confused once more before spotting the fire and moving in its direction. After packing, we departed. To put it mildly, the journey back was frightening, yet we were able to reach our vehicle and depart. This incident caused me to reflect on the entire camping trip, recalling the activity we heard on the first night outside our camp and simply piecing everything together. The man out there was probably keeping an eye on us the entire time, waiting for one of us to be by ourselves. It is really unsettling to even consider his existence outside our campsite, while we were conversing, sleeping, and doing everything we had no idea about. Though we never want to return to those woods, we nevertheless occasionally discuss that camping trip. Hours away from my home for a quick trip by myself. I didn't pick it for any specific reason. In order to get away from the city and spend a few days in peace, I just opened the Airbnb map and searched for something affordable and fairly remote in a smaller town. Since I intended to spend almost the whole day at the Airbnb, I didn't really care how lovely the town was. The house I reserved was the only one in the entire area available on Airbnb, and was situated alone in a small woodland within this tiny town. But I was drawn in by the attractive pricing. Until I reached the house, I traveled largely along deserted wooded roads. If I'm being honest, though, I suppose it was more of a cabin. There were no other homes or structures in sight, and it was older and encircled by trees. I carried everything inside after opening the squeaky front door. Before settling in for the next few days, all I had to do was head to the grocery shop and fill up on food and beverages. I entered the town via car. There were hardly any other cars or people out, even though it was mid-afternoon. Perhaps it was simply because I was from a city, but even for a little place like I had the impression that I was traveling through a ghost town. The grocery shop was also deserted when I strolled through it. The few people I did see, however, followed me with their eyes and gave me an odd, icy look. They all seemed to be aware that I wasn't from here, and it didn't sit well with them. It was quite strange. After obtaining everything I required, I returned to the cabin. I believe that at that point, I had mostly come to the conclusion that my paranoia was unfounded. Those individuals couldn't possibly give a damn about who I was. I was just a regular customer at a supermarket. I dismissed it and was relieved that I wasn't spending the remainder of the journey in town. In the living room, I unpacked and watched TV. The entire evening and the following day were peaceful. However, it was pouring outdoors the next night. A storm had arrived, although it didn't appear to was about to slow down or stop. Naturally, I was curled up inside, half asleep on the couch when the cabin door was knocked on. I leaped to my feet and glanced at the door. No one could have been outside the house during this storm. I looked at my phone, but there were no texts or anything provided by the Airbnb host. Additionally, there was only one knock on the door. I stood up and went over after about 30 seconds. I looked out and saw no one. Nevertheless, there was no porch light and it was really dark. Thus, I was unable to open the door. Make out a lot. My thoughts raced through every scenario that wasn't someone knocking on the door as the minutes went by, like something getting blown over by a storm or even me dreaming about it while half asleep. I feel that I simply didn't want to accept that there was someone out there, because I knew that would be uncomfortable, With the TV on, I reclined on the couch and simply lay there, sort of paying half attention. A respectable period of time passed. If I had to guess, I would estimate it to be around an hour, although I wasn't keeping count. Although the TV was relatively quiet, the storm was still continuing. But in between those noises, I heard a sudden coughing sound behind me, like a man trying to hide his cough. I quickly jerked my head back and noticed something moving away from the window's exterior. I had only witnessed a brief moment of it, not enough to make hearing the cough clearly revealed if it was a figure or a reflection. There was a person outside the Airbnb. I immediately felt shivers because I knew they must have been peering through the window into the cabin. I reached for my phone and called 911, reporting that I believed I was being stalked and that there was a trespasser outdoors. I couldn't tell if they had fled or were still out there because the storm was too loud for me to hear any footsteps. When a policeman arrived about 3 minutes later, I was relieved. The cop was clearly unfazed by anything as I opened the door and began to explain what was happening. He just said, "That's it," once I had done describing. Like it wasn't a huge issue. Nothing, including notes, was taken by the officer. Like everyone else in the town, he had that icy expression. He appeared to be genuinely upset with me for forcing him to come out into the storm to assist me. He added that since he didn't see anyone when he pulled in, he should call if something did happen. He turned his back on me and drove off before I could say anything more. To be honest, I couldn't believe it. That made me feel even less secure and more uneasy about whatever the hell was going on, occurring in this place. I felt uneasy about this entire place. I made the decision to call it early and simply leave since I knew something wasn't right. I hurried to pack my belongings after locking the door. All I could do was unzip my backpack and start packing clothing into it. After the police left about 60 seconds later, there were loud knocks on the front door once more, but this time they stayed. They kept pounding on the door. I knew this was the person who had been observing because I just looked out the bedroom window to make sure the police car was gone. Me. In barely 3 or 4 minutes, I packed all I could. I considered calling the police once more, but to be honest, I feared that doing so would only get me into problems, or that even if the police did arrest them, they would somehow side with the other person. However, they abruptly halted knocking. It seemed as though the storm was getting louder. I approached the door in silence and peered out since I couldn't hear if they had left. I didn't see anything. There was nobody out there. I was aware that I had to depart whenever I had the chance, so I had my car keys ready and my knapsack on. After spending approximately a minute at the door, I happened to look back. I observed something move at that same window once more. I was aware that this was my only opportunity to flee. I bolted from the cabin into the storm after swinging open the door. Knowing that the individual was most likely running around the house to get to me made my heart race. After getting into my car and turning it on, I left the driveway. I was only able to see 10 feet ahead due to the intense precipitation. I'm not sure if they pursued me or not. I wouldn't have been able to see them if they had been directly behind me, sprinting toward the car as I moved away. I left town and drove all the way home without stopping after traveling down the wooded driveway until I reached the road. I have never experienced something so eerie and scary in my life. I believe it's more worse because I have no idea why any of it was occurring, or even who was sneaking about the cabin, beating on the door and observing me through the windows. I can't stop thinking about the strange vibe I had in that town. Perhaps people knew the cabin was an Airbnb, and they went there because they detested strangers for some reason. Drastic methods to get rid of me. I almost had the impression that I was in the heart of a community where everyone belonged to a secret cult. Things might have gotten out of hand if I had stayed that night. Fortunately, I didn't need to locate out, however. Only 7 or 8 months have passed since then. I had been good friends with my friend Josh since my final year of college, which was roughly 3 years ago. We were quite close during our final year of college, but because of employment and everything that came after, I ultimately relocating to a city roughly 3 hours away from him. Even though it had been more than a year since we last saw one another, we were still in touch and remained close friends, frequently staying up late to play games and text each other during the day. Regular stuff like that, you know. However, on a Thursday, somewhere outside of the blue called to ask if I would want to spend the weekend at his apartment as his girlfriend was away for the weekend. Strangely, he sounded like he had just woken up or was quite exhausted during the call, but whatever. I promised to come there because I didn't have any plans that weekend and hadn't seen him in a long time. I traveled out there on Friday morning after spending the night packing. I had to make a few trips to get drinks and other necessities, so the drive took up most of my day. Nevertheless, I arrived at his place at 4:30. Josh had rushed to this location with his girlfriend of 4 or 5 years to purchase straight out of college. The house was really inexpensive and they both already had employment. Undoubtedly outdated, but still reasonably priced. 30 minutes from the college we attended. It was kind of trashy and in the middle of nowhere, not in a neighborhood or anything like that. I approached the door, knocked, and then knocked once again. Before he answered the door and allowed me inside, I believe I waited outside for a full 5 minutes. Right away I saw how different his appearance was. His face was covered in an expression of extreme exhaustion. This was a little odd because he normally had a lot of energy. However, I reasoned that perhaps he was simply having a bad day or something. We spent time together and mostly just catching up and hanging out like we used to. We had a few drinks and played some Xbox. Even so, Josh had changed significantly from a year earlier, or even from our online gaming days. However, he behaved entirely differently in person. To be honest, it seemed as though he had no desire to spend time with me. Once more, I assumed he was simply having a strange day. We all have them after all. However, as the evening wore on and before I overindulged, I suggested that perhaps we should simply go to bed early. Go to bed now so that tomorrow we can be re-energized for the entire day. But he responded, "We should stay up tonight," in a weary, grumpy voice and with drooping eyelids. He was barely able to stay awake, it seemed. Thus, this was becoming quite strange. And the more I suggested that we simply go to bed, the more insistent he became. I consented to stay for an additional 30 minutes or so. However, it was somewhat uncomfortable at the moment. Clearly, he was too exhausted to carry on a conversation. As a result, we spent the majority of the time just sitting quietly and occasionally taking a sip of our drinks. To be honest, I felt so uneasy that I didn't even feel like I was in the same room as one of my friends. I questioned how this was the same person I used to know and spend a lot of time with, and why was he just acting this way, an individual? I attempted to inquire about his activities and how things were going, but he shied away from such inquiries. He attempted to get me to remain up, but I eventually told him that I needed to go to bed. To be honest, I was a little uneasy and concerned about him, but I hoped that would be more typical the following day. I entered the spare bedroom to prepare for bed, but there was something strange about it. There was nobody in the room. Other than the tiny bed against the wall, nothing was in there. And equally peculiar, it appeared to spanking new, as if it were purchased especially for my visit. I was starting to think that I was overanalyzing everything by this point. Nevertheless, all I really wanted to do was check on Josh. I texted his girlfriend as a result. They had been together for 5 years, as I mentioned, and we had a few get-togethers when we were in college, but I didn't truly know her. It took me just a few minutes to hear back from her. I had only mentioned that Josh seemed out of it and was acting a little strangely. I then inquired as to whether she had seen anything lately, or if she might have known why he was acting this way at the moment. She said that they had split up, that she had moved out 4 months prior, and that she had no idea what I was referring to. What, in fact, I was shocked. Why did he make up the story that she was only away for the weekend? And why didn't he invite me over months ago instead of now? The numbers didn't add up. It only made me feel like I couldn't trust him anymore, and didn't explain why he was acting so strangely, making the entire situation more unpleasant. I went to leave the room because I didn't want to go to sleep without finding answers, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I noticed a shadow standing directly behind the door. He moved away after a moment. My heart began to race a little as I approached the door, listened, opened it, entered the corridor, and shut the door after me. I heard him moving about in his bedroom and noticed that the door was open. Now that the house's lights were out, I immediately saw something that wasn't there before on the rear side of the door. It was a mount with one side bolted into the door and the other into the wall. I was in the room trying to find out what was going on, so he must have just done this, most likely by hand screwing it in. I didn't want to spend any more time with him inside that house. I began swiftly and discreetly leaving. I noticed something on the kitchen counter as soon as I entered the living room. It was a lock in an open package, one of those locks for doors that are only accessible from one side. My stomach dropped, and then I heard hurried footsteps from behind. When I glanced around, Josh had the same lifeless, exhausted expression on his face. He didn't answer when I asked what the hell he was attempting to do. I sensed that he was going to do something. I dashed to the front door before he could. I continued, getting into my car and driving away, even though he yelled my name a few times in that weird, worn-out voice. I pondered and relaxed about what had just transpired over the entire commute. Josh had blocked me on everything by the time I arrived home, which increased my confidence that what he was doing was terrible. However, I did nothing about it at the time. I was foolish, and I suppose I thought I had nothing to share because nothing had happened yet. It was also difficult for me to turn him in because we had been close for 3 years. But I still don't know why he was attempting to lock me in that room or even what his true plan was. It's strange that after 3 years of getting to know him, I feel as though I didn't truly know him. Simply put, I'm relieved that I was able to escape it at that time.